I don't know if you guys have any kind of plan, but I wrote down some notes or some like just some questions we could go over basically.
Sure, yeah.
So I think the first question to think about is what is knowledge? The second one is what is epistemology? And then the third one I have is what are the main theories of knowledge? And I think if we go through those, we'll, cover the ground fairly well.
Right. And maybe just as an addendum or whatever, or just a thought that I had is how is knowledge or how is epistemology, I guess, different from truth or the study
Hmm.
of truth?
Yeah, that's also another something I was going to bring up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I guess we'll get to that in the second one. Let's start with what is knowledge, because that's like the first big issue, and we were kind of debating that or discussing that in the chat the other day. All right, so I have three definitions that I came up with that are kind of nested. The first is the most general, which is fit of form to function. So we might say the flower knows how to attract bees, right? That's fit of form to function. The next one is the ability to do things. We might say he knows how to skate, he knows how to dance, he knows how to sink a three-pointer or whatever. So those are the first two. And then the third, the more specific one, is the ability to predict. And that's where you get into representations, right? Because prediction involves some way of representing reality. You can't talk about prediction until you have a representation scheme, right? Because what you're really doing when you predict is you're predicting information within some scheme based on other information in that scheme. So I would say there's no such thing as prediction without a model. Anyway, and then I would say that these things are nested in the sense that the ability to predict enables you to do things. And the ability to do things is part of this more general biological concept of fit of form to function. So what do you guys think about those definitions?
Well,
Well, yeah, you go ahead.
yeah. Something that crossed my mind is when you were talking about the fit of form to function. That kind of reminds me of something that Richard Dawkins was talking about. The genes, they don't have like direct influence on the form of a biological creature, but I think he used the word predict. Basically, they have to be able to anticipate the type of problems that organism might face in the future. Not like that they're consciously anticipating these things, but I don't know where I'm going with this. It's just it kind of reminded me. How do I?
Well, there is a kind of knowledge in genes, right? The knowledge of the form that works in the environment. I don't know if I would say prediction, but there is, I mean, it is fit of form to function, which is analogous to prediction in a way.
Yeah.
I just want to say I find this really a strange approach. Like, I'm not judging it, whatever it's bad or whatever, but I would have never even I would have never thought of about knowledge in those terms, right? So
Mm.
fit, function, form to function, or genes have knowledge. Like I've always just like basically thought about it in terms of, well, a brain is the thing that has knowledge, right? You have knowledge stored in your brain about the world or whatever, about what you want to do or stuff like that. Um, so so it's interesting to me that you started out with the fit of form to function, and then you, State of the Nile, you made the bridge to the gene. And I would have just like that a gene has knowledge. To me, it seems like a misapplication of the term, but yeah,
It's definitely a different usage.
but yeah, but I don't know. But that is what's going through my head right now as I'm listening to you.
Do you want to define knowledge your way or like come up with a different definition?
No, like all I know is like the standard definition, right, of the justified true belief thing, and that you can then go and try to m- modify it and remove like justified and just leave the true belief or whatever, right? Or you could even, well, I don't know if you could like remove any one of the three, but basically, yeah, I'm aware of the Aristotle definition and then the Gettier thing that was.
What is the Aristotle definition? Is it just justified true belief?
Yeah.
So Aristotle would not consider the ability to skate being a kind of knowledge, or remembering a face, like being able to recognize somebody's face as knowledge. Like, because that seems very limited, at least the way we use the term now. That, like, we don't just use it to refer to beliefs, we use it to refer to any kind of stored information that is used to make decisions.
I think he was really just drawing like an area around like the cognitive thing, which I guess it's hard to make a distinction there between being able to recognize a face, because that's also cognitive, right? But
well, it's kind of precognitive, but if you think about it, it's not a specific belief. The ability to recognize a face is not a specific instance of recognizing the face. Like, when you specifically recognize a face, then you have a belief that, oh, that's Fred or whatever. But in order to recognize Fred, you must have the concept of Fred in your brain, right? So you must have some knowledge of what Fred looks like.
Yeah,
and sure. Is that belief or is that something else? And
yeah, I don't know. But from what I understand is that the justified true belief thing is supposed to represent like the entire thing, like the truthfulness of the of the thing in question, then your position towards that thing, and then that is supposed to connect those two.
Okay, so just going back to the justified true belief definition, I'll say why that to me just seems kind of empty.
I think I disconnected there for a second.
It's still recording, so I think we're good.
Okay, basically what I was saying is that like there's Fred.
Okay.
But I gotta have like a justification for why I think that that's Fred, right? So, and that is then like the connector between I guess the truth bearer and the truth maker, which I could explain. I don't know if those terms are necessarily useful, but I guess those are the terms that are being used in like epistemology, in philosophy.
Yeah, I think that whole approach is a dead end, because it ignores how you recognize Fred. Like, that you have to have some pattern in your mind that you use to recognize Fred. I mean, you could call it a belief in a way, but it's, I don't know, I would call it a concept. But also, I think the definition of knowledge as justified true belief is just taking one word and splitting it into three words that don't have any meaning apart from each other. Right? So I don't see that as getting at anything. Like, that definition doesn't seem to me to like be a useful way of thinking about knowledge, because all it's doing is saying if you have these three conditions, then you have knowledge. But what are the three conditions?
Well, I guess.
I think
go ahead.
You have a good point that it's not really saying much, but something that I mentioned in Discord was that I don't think the point is to give a detailed account, and this is why that theories of truth are considered separate from epistemology, I guess. So I think the point is just to establish that you can't know things that are false. Then also you can't accidentally come to know things. So it has to be justified. So that's basically all they're trying to establish here.
Yeah, but, well, okay, for me it's just profoundly unsatisfying, because it does not get into the question of, well, it just doesn't get into any question about what knowledge is, right? It's just, Yeah, you can say you can't know something if it's false, but what does that mean? Like, we can't just assume our ordinary notions of false. So I think the problem with that definition is that it takes those things for granted, or it encourages people to take those things for granted as if we already know those things, as if we already have some notion of justification and truth and all that stuff. And even if those things could be separated somehow, which I don't think they can be. There was something else there, but what was it? Well, it comes from that analytic school of thought that the people who use that definition tend to think about knowledge in a certain prototypical way as being like deductive knowledge, like theorems of mathematics and that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Which is why your initial claim or your initial definition, or I guess, well, not definition, but the initial statements that you made about the form and function thing, why that surprised me, because that doesn't fit in any way that I can see into that idea.
Into which idea?
Into the justified true belief thing.
Oh,
because,
yeah.
like, it doesn't have anything like like knowing how to ride a bike or something, right? It's like, what is it? Justified true belief? Like, it doesn't
Right.
it doesn't have anything to do with either one of those.
Yeah. So I guess my criticism is they're starting like way too far down. Like, they're starting with things that are very far removed from sensory experience, from motor experience. They're starting at the wrong end. They're starting with very abstract statements, like in language. And my point would be that that's the wrong place to start. You have to understand how knowledge comes to us from experience. Like, if you start out with the assumption that, oh, I have all these ideas and they're just like sentences that I can write down, and then I can look at these sentences, I can say, oh, this one's justified, this one isn't, this one is true, this one is false. You know, it's just sort of, I think it's just packing the idea up into the concepts and dismissing it. You know, it sort of hides the actual problem of what knowledge is and just acts as if there's something meaningful about discussing this, you know, the Gettier problem, when you don't have an actual theory of induction or knowledge at all, or how it relates to reality or truth. You know, when you don't have any of those theories, what's the point of the Gettier problem?
And I think that's why the Gettier problem is considered legitimate in the first place. Because, I mean, it strikes me as really stupid. Like, it's just people being difficult for the sake of being difficult. But if you actually understand or have an understanding of what truth is and all that, well, then it just looks dumb, you know?
Yeah, that's a good critique of it. It just looks... No, you're right. I mean, that is kind of my basic reaction to it. After thinking about knowledge myself for many, many years, and then encountering stuff like that in an epistemology course, I was just like, yeah, this is just kind of dumb. They're not really dealing with the actual issues. They're just playing word games.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, so, you're not necessarily defending the analytic definition here, but...
Well, it's like the only definition that I'm familiar
Okay.
with, so it's interesting in that sense that I am like trying to, I don't know, not visualize, but to think about any, like, going outside of that definition. And I'm so I'm like trying to think, well, okay, so yeah, what you're saying makes sense, but it's completely new to me, so trying to familiarize myself with the notion that, yeah, I mean, knowledge is actually it reaches way further than just facts or something that apply to, like, things that you can learn from a book or something like that, right? 'Cause
Yeah.
you gotta know how to open the book in the first place and things like that.
Yeah, I would say that analytic epistemology is kind of like theorizing about knowledge under the assumption that you already know what knowledge is. Then there are just some little nitpicky definitional problems or little like logic problems to be solved. I know that's a bit unfair, but it's a slightly unfair way of saying it quickly.
Yeah, I guess it excludes embodied experience, right? It's just more about like the cognitive, the purely, well, analytical is the right term for it, right? About that aspect of experience, rather than basically what we do mostly throughout the days, as we know how to take a step forward without falling over or tripping or something like that, right?
Yeah, okay. So state of denial, do those definitions make sense to you? Do you want to...
Well, something that I mentioned was that I think that truth and knowledge are synonymous, or something that... Yeah, so I was just going off of the justified true belief thing, but I was thinking that my understanding of truth necessitates some sort of justification, since I emphasize, the relevance of the subject to the whole process. And then, it's by that point that it doesn't make sense to make a distinction between knowledge and truth. So, like, if I provide a definition of truth and how we generate representations, mental representations of our experiences, and explain and predict things, well then, that is what truth is, but that's also just knowledge. Like, what exactly would be the distinction here?
Well, you can know things that are wrong, right?
No, I mean, that's what I would disagree with. If it's wrong, then it's not knowledge, it's just a belief.
But according to whom is it just a belief? Like, if nobody knows what is true, then it just seems that you're assigning this label to it. It's just
but what do you mean no one knows that it's true?
Well, there are things
you know it's true.
But there are things that nobody knows if they're true or not, right?
I mean, if something's indeterminate, then we just call that a belief. But again, until we establish that it's coherence to a model that explains and predicts things, then a belief, you can't call that knowledge. That's just something that you think is true. At least you perceive it as true.
So it becomes true if it can make predictions?
Well, it coheres to a model that, like a more general model that can explain and predict things. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the problems with that analytic definition, is that it assumes that things are true or false in some kind of absolute sense, that it's not just a model that bears some relation to reality that allows you to predict some aspect of reality. But it's a more ordinary use of the word truth that we use in ordinary life, contrasted with false. Like, you either did this or you didn't, and for our purposes in ordinary life, it's a binary distinction.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. I agree that treating it as like a discrete binary is, I guess, problematic. It makes more sense to think of things as more or less representative, especially once you get to the more general models of, reality itself.
Yeah. Or like scientific theories, for example. That's a good example where calling them true or false is a little bit misleading, but you would consider them to be knowledge because they give you the ability to predict within a representational framework.
Yeah, and actually, I can agree with that a little bit as well. I realize I said knowledge and truth were so similar, but I've always consciously made I never said that truth was just a model of experience. I always specified it as like a belief that coheres to a model of experience. So it's like the more discrete beliefs that are true.
But they can only be true within a framework that assigns...
Yeah. Like, the point is that they cohere to a model.
I would say they are models within a bigger model or a theory.
Yeah, it's kind of like nested models. that are
Yeah, well, I
more or
don't
less
know.
general.
Terminology is kind of tricky, but
Yeah.
they're representations of some aspect of reality. But the representation has to exist within a language, within a modeling framework, right? Like if you make a statement in the language of Newtonian mechanics, you're going to have to use terms like force and mass and acceleration that are within that framework, which are not themselves of reality, right?
Yeah.
So, since there's no way to escape some conceptual framework, there's no way to call something true in a sense that is removed from that conceptual framework. So it might be true within that framework, but that doesn't mean that it's true in some absolute sense, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And a different framework might allow you to make statements that are better at representing reality, better at predicting experience.
Well, the justification aspect of it applies to the more general models or like the framework. It's not like specific beliefs that you're like the specific beliefs are probably the predictions you're making. But when you want to actually confirm something, it's the more general framework or the more general model that matters, right?
Well, I think you do both. I mean, in science, you're concerned with the general model or the general theory, but when you're an engineer, you want to confirm specific things like, will this beam hold up this building, or will this circuit actually do what I think it's going to do, right?
Yeah, because you've got to get some sort of agreement between the two.
Well, I think they both depend on sensory experience, let's say.
Yeah.
They're both empirical. One is more generic, the other is more specific, but they're both empirical, right? A specific claim about the world is empirical, and a general theory about the world is also empirical, because both of them depend on the data of experience ultimately. Like they're both ultimately based on the data of experience. So I think we sort of agree on that view, right?
Yeah, and actually, this might be somewhat tangential, but this actually reminds me of the race realist guy on Twitter. I remember he was trying to make a distinction between the empirical and the conceptual, and like he comes up with these like conceptual arguments against, the idea that the mind is purely physical or something, and then he'll just ignore all of the empirical evidence. I saw a conversation between you and him, and he was like,
yeah.
like Down syndrome's irrelevant because I disproved it conceptually or something.
I actually got him to shut up for once. He never shuts up usually, right? That's the only time he's ever just shut up.
Yeah,
He had no answer to that one.
Yeah, I just kept thinking like conceptual arguments. They're just more general models of experience, right? I mean, you can't just make the conceptual empirical distinction. That's a false dichotomy. All knowledge is empirical and conceptual simultaneously. It's just a matter of how general your concepts are, right?
I think, just as a bit of an aside, I think the race realist guy is some kind of religious person who wants to carve out a space for the soul. That's my sense of him. And those kinds of people tend to, they believe that you can sort of pull some rabbit out of logic, that you can get some knowledge out of logic that doesn't have empirical content.
Yeah, it's like rationalism. They think that you can use pure reason to, like, they think that reason has some sort of direct connection to reality itself, and you can just make like absolute statements about the nature of reality without any reference to experience, which is nonsensical.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, this reminded me of the distinction of that I told you about, BG, the last time we talked, where this dude Tom Jump on YouTube that he employs, where he makes this distinction between empirical, what is the other one that we just talked about? Conceptual, right? And then metaphysical claims, right?
Yeah.
But the idea would be like if you said something like the soul, that wouldn't be empirical, or it would be a conceptual idea in the sense that you're saying I came up with the idea of the soul, just to take it as an example. But to say that the soul exists, that would be a metaphysical claim, right? So it wouldn't just be a conceptual claim, because a conceptual claim would be just to say, well, I thought of this idea of the soul, so I think that the soul exists. But to make this kind of absolute statement, that would always be metaphysical. But to make it empirical, you would have to capture the soul in a bottle or whatever, right? Or in a laboratory setting, and then present it and say, look, I found the soul. Here it is. And so I don't really know what the point is, but I was just thinking that you were saying both empirical and conceptual claims have an empirical component, I guess. But I think that you can still draw a distinction there, where you say no, look, I imagined something in my mind, right, like a Pegasus or something like that I've never seen.
Well, but it still depends on it, though, in the sense that the concepts you construct that idea out of came from experience. They came from...
Yeah, sure. I don't want to deny that it is completely divorced from empirical... go ahead.
Well, I can jump in here. I think it is useful to make a distinction between, say, a conceptual and empirical, at least in the sense that sometimes you can have two, what's the word, underdetermined theories. So basically you have two theories that both fit the empirical data, and they're completely incommensurable. You can't reconcile the two. So, I mean, it's not that one is conceptual and one is not, and one is empirical. It's just that in both senses, we've constructed a concept designed to represent experience, and these concepts are just irreconcilable.
Mm-hmm.
So the disagreement between the two theories is purely conceptual, really.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's the point, that representations depend on the subject and the object. They're not direct knowledge of reality. I guess what you would say is that conceptual distinction then is also outside of knowledge in a way, if it has no effect on prediction. You might say that it's pragmatic. If one is simpler than the other, we might prefer one because it's simpler, or it has more general implications, so it might be easier to falsify. But then you're getting into empirical claims as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The disagreement isn't really in terms of knowledge, unless one has greater predictive power. But I guess that's not. We're talking about underdetermination, so I guess that doesn't.
Yeah, you brought metaphysics into it. This concept to me is just. Well, I just don't think it has any uses, maybe, or many uses. I don't know.
You mean metaphysics as such?
Well, what does it exactly mean, anyway?
Well, the way I think about it is it's like where you stop asking questions, right? It's where you arrived at the ground level of reality, let's say, and you say, okay, uncreated God is the final level. We can't ask anything about him because he was always there, or something like that, right? So metaphysics is to me, well, it's not necessarily limited to that, but it's like this fundamental level that's beyond anything that is it's just like you stop asking questions.
So it's like meta-empirical.
Right.
Meta-empirical aspects of knowledge. That's what the term metaphysics is used to refer to, I guess, right? The conceptual assumptions, deep conceptual assumptions that are built into the framework through which you interpret experience, like causality, space, time, all of those kinds of things.
Right,
okay.
Exactly. It's these ground level things that you can't really empirically test because they are like presuppositions, right? It's like we're back at the transcendental argument. Those are the things usually that you can defend using the transcendental argument because you can't do without them. And and of course you can then like tie them up with whatever God or the multiverse or whatever, but you can't really get at those things empirically or conceptually. Well, I guess I mean that presupposes that we're using now this distinction, but like metaphysics is basically like this the thing that grounds everything else.
So I guess my metaphysics would be the subject, right? That there are inescapable properties of the subject.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, right. And so I think, okay, so this just came into my mind. So in the beginning, when I was arguing with you about the God thing, and I was like looking for an ism to like label you with, like, are you a solipsist? Are you a materialist? That's like basically the way to go. If you're trying to be an apologist, for example, because then you can say, aha, so these are your limitations. So you are starting from these basic assumptions that everything that exists is matter, let's say, or energy and matter or whatever, doesn't matter. But and then you can like go from there, because you can then say, aha, but you have no explanation for whatever mathematics or something in your worldview.
I mean, it is a good technique. It does work. It does confuse the hell out of people who have never thought about those things.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't want to say that metaphysics is just that. It's just like a debate tactics. But it's like basically it's like the box that kind of...
Yeah, the biggest box that we can think inside of, or at least as far as we know, it's the biggest box we can think inside of, because it's the one we're thinking inside of now, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like that, yeah.
Okay, so I think we could go on to the next thing, which is which we kind of already got into, but it's what is epistemology? Constructing descriptive and normative theories of knowledge. That would be my definition. And I think there's a question about how it relates to psychology. Like, is epistemology entangled with psychology, or is it something that we can disentangle from it? And if so, how? So I'll just, I'll let you guys talk. I'm going to get some water.
All right. Well, for epistemology, I would just say it's the study of what knowledge is and then how we acquire it, essentially. And
right. Yeah, that's what that would have been my answer as well, but now I kind of realize that it's almost like circular, right? Like it almost doesn't tell you anything.
Well, of course, that's just like that's just the starting point, you know.
Yeah. I understand. I like I said, that would have been my definition as well. But I just now like thinking on the fly about it after what we've just discussed.
Yeah.
I realized that like all of these definitions, they are like a bit well, they're a bit wobbly, kind of.
Yeah. So, and I don't think you can really disentangle epistemology from psychology. I mean, it's integral to my understanding of how we acquire knowledge, that we represent experience in our minds. And of course, we have to have certain psychological predispositions, you know, these cognitive predispositions, and that allow us to recognize patterns in experience, right? You know, like we intuitively and naturally view things through like a framework of generalizations and particulars. So you recognize if you come across like a particular thing, you immediately nest that within a generalization, and you can also recognize that as a particular. So you immediately start modeling it in that sense, right?
Right.
So yeah, and just in that sense, I would say that psychology can't be disentangled, just because, again, knowledge is how we represent reality with our minds, and our minds have a certain structure, which informs how we recognize patterns and make models.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that you cannot disentangle the subject from basically anything. Like it's just the nature of of it all, of reality, basically. Like, you can't disentangle the subject from metaphysics, from epistemology, from ethics, obviously, if you
Yeah.
if you want to go into ethics.
Mm.
But yeah, the subject is always there. It's like that's I think therefore I am, right. That's like that's why you can't throw away the subject.
Yeah.
I think we pretty much all agree then on what epistemology is, that it's theorizing about knowledge, right? Theorizing about knowledge, what it is, how we acquire it.
Yeah, what
and
it
that
means,
is
how to, yeah.
that's partly psychological and partly philosophical. And I guess in what way is it philosophical? Is it just dealing with the self-referentiality, like not taking that for granted and understanding that the implications of a psychological theory that your brain in the skull is that your knowledge is necessarily empirical and conditional on the brain and all that other stuff? That's where philosophy comes into it, right? It's like
Well, it's almost like now we got to talk about what is philosophy as opposed to psychology. Like,
right.
philosophy is like trying to take the bird's eye view or something like that. Like trying to disentangle, trying to strip away the emotional, the personal, all of that, and looking at it like in a like lab setting, right? In a clean.
Well, science does that too, but I think what philosophy does is I guess you could say it doesn't take those metaphysical assumptions for granted.
Yeah, I think that philosophy is just more like meta topics, just looking at the the fundamental assumptions that we're making. So, yeah. So then the referentiality that you mentioned earlier, that's when it becomes philosophy. It's just when you start thinking about things as confirming themselves and being circular.
I think it also deals with the implications for you as a subject, like facing existence. Like, if you have a certain psychological theory, then that's going to affect your understanding of your own self, your own life. You know, it could create despair. You know, like, I'll never understand anything. I'm trapped in my skull, kind of thing. And psychology doesn't deal with that, right? Psychology is just, let's understand the way the brain works. Philosophy is like, let's think about the implications of this psychological theory for how we approach life. You know, for like, what should we do? Like the big philosophical questions are, why are we here? What should we do with our lives? How do we know anything? You know, there are these big questions, but they all are about us. Whereas science is about the world.
Yeah.
Science kind of excises the subject, or tries to.
Obviously, in science, you also refer back to yourself, because who cares about the world in just an objective sense? There's always like what is in it for me, right? Like even in science.
Oh yeah, science is motivated by that, but I mean, the scientific theories don't include the subject at all. Usually, I mean, there are a few exceptions where the subject is sort of snuck in there, like in quantum theory, it's kind of snuck in there, and even in thermodynamics, it's a little bit subjective, but
yeah, I've been thinking about that actually, about the quantum stuff, like this stupid idea that the wave function is collapsed because you look at it or something like that. Like, just now I've been thinking about, like,
have you been watching draft physics videos?
No, it's actually this. I don't remember what it's called, but it's this like really famous video on YouTube. Doctor something, Doctor Slit experiment or something like that, where it's like they were basically misleading people and showing them like, oh, the scientist is now looking at the particle, and by looking at it, he makes it split into the wave thing. Anyway, that's that's not the point. But what I was thinking of is, like, earlier I said that the subject is like at the core of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, whatever. And now, and just now, the thought entered my mind that quantum physics is like getting to the bottom of physical reality, right? And that
yeah, and when you get to the very bottom, suddenly you're staring at the subject.
right, and that the subject is suddenly involved or is playing a huge part in the fundamental reality, like uh, that would make sense to me personally, but yeah, I don't know. That was just like an idea that I just had.
Yeah, no. I thought about that too. That it's interesting that the deepest physical theories, the most fundamental physical theories, do sort of get tangled up in the subject, and that's why you can't ever escape from philosophy, because you can't escape from subjectivity, right? And so even like science sort of pretends that you can, and it's very successful by doing that, and it makes great efforts to minimize the effect of specific things, of specific aspects of the subject, like your perspective. You know, like the perspective of a person standing on the Earth is removed by the Copernican model of the solar system, right? The Copernican model is like a God's eye view of the solar system. So science can go down that road quite a ways, but it can never get outside the subject.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's... Oh, there's a siren going by. Hold on.
It's a metaphysics police. They're coming to get you.
Okay, so I wanted to go through the schools of epistemology, or the main theories of knowledge.
Okay.
Which is basically the same thing, right? So I'll just read out the ones I listed, and if you can think of some others, then let me know. So I think the first is naive realism, which is just kind of ignoring the problem, like just assuming that our representations are direct knowledge of reality, and ignoring the distinction between the representation and what it represents. And maybe scientism is a little bit of a more sophisticated version of that, which is that we may not be able to do that as individuals, but if we have lots of instruments and computers, we can somehow, escape from subjectivity.
I would say that is basically like the most common view today.
Yeah, I think it's the default view, because we just naturally use we have no choice but to use representations to model reality. So we're going to treat them as if they're real unless there's an error. Like it's only when there's some kind of illusion or some kind of conflict that you become aware that your belief is not reality.
But even then, the error would be like in the measurement process, not in the assumption itself. Like you would still.
Yeah. Then you go looking for what did I do wrong? Like how did I not? Yeah, exactly. What got in the way of my direct connection to reality?
Right. So that is actually, I think maybe it's a useful way to distinguish science from philosophy, where science would go looking at the equipment and say, "Oh, where did I go wrong with the measurement or something?" Whereas philosophy would say, "Oh, maybe the entire theory is wrong. Maybe we should throw out the entire theory, the entire representation theory, or something like that."
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think it's just that science doesn't really deal with those questions. Like it just assumes that we have some way of measuring things, and
That's right. And that would again circle back to this empirical versus metaphysical, in this case, distinction, where science just doesn't care about the metaphysics. It just says whatever, it doesn't matter. We're just, here is something that we can measure. Here is something. Here's a world that we can like.
Well, let's assume reason works. Let's assume our brains work. Let's assume that our senses work, and then let's try to figure things out. And yeah, it's very, very effective, but
right. Okay.
But it is a little bit naive or deliberately ignorant, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, so other ones are idealism, which is nobody really believes, but it's one of those, I mean, it's a useful theory or a school of thought, because you can contrast it with other schools of thought.
Well, Eric Orwell believes idealism, right?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Pantheism and the multiverse is a version of idealism. It's a new version.
Yeah, and then there's also the theories about the quantum mechanics that we brought up earlier, where consciousness collapses the wave function. That's like another form of idealism.
Yeah, that is a version of idealism. Yeah. So yeah, we need to address it, but I'm just saying that it's a very unusual view. But yeah, I guess you're right though. That like nowadays it's fashionable to believe this specific version of it with the mind collapsing wave functions and stuff like that. Maybe it's not as rare actually.
I mean, we actually talked about it in my cognitive science class.
Actually, aspects of this are involved in a lot of religious and magical thinking. Yeah. So I guess there's a tiny bit of idealism in a lot of people's worldviews.
Yeah, I think in a strange way, like science refuted idealism, but then as it got into the quantum stuff, it like brought it back or something. Like a horseshoe theory or whatever. I don't know.
The horseshoe theory of epistemology?
Of idealism. I don't know. Because like, we can imagine anything, but now, oh no, look, science tells us everything is material. But then as they got into the quantum stuff, then the idealism returned, kind of a thing. But whatever. I'm just like.
No, it's true. It's interesting, right? It is interesting that idealism kind of pops back up there. So, well, let me just list these out, and then we'll go through each one in turn, because otherwise we might miss some of them. Mm-hmm. All right, so I had naive realism, idealism. I put down Platonism, although I don't know if anybody really believes that either, except for
you gotta honor Plato.
Except for Jay Dyer, but
no, he doesn't like he doesn't like Platonism because that goes against Christianity. Don't you know?
Oh, okay. Really interesting.
Well, of course, because there is a distinction between the material and the ideas. Okay.
Well, hold that thought because I don't. This is going to be a huge digression.
Okay. yeah.
All right, so materialism, which was another one of the ones that that also seems to come up mostly in Christian apologetics as a way to label a so-called scientific worldview or skeptical worldview. Mm-hmm. Pragmatism, which is like, Jordan Peterson's, and, obviously he didn't invent it, but he seems to have something like that.
Yeah, I would be interested in talking about that one because I don't really. Well, no, go ahead, finish.
Okay, yeah, we will. I just wanted to list them all, and and then if you think of other ones, we'll add them to the list, and then we'll go through them. Okay, so yeah, pragmatism, then nihilism, which is like throw up your hands and say, "Lol," I guess. And then the one that I was looking for a term because you wanted to categorize me, and I think that's a worthwhile thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so I think the closest term that fits the theory of knowledge that I have and that state of denial is sort of converging on is representationalism. Okay. Which is we have representations, and the representations are different from what they represent. They have properties that are of the mind, let's say, or conceptual, but they also have empirical content. So they have both empirical and you could say conceptual or metaphysical content. And I think that's state of denial. You think that describes your view reasonably well?
Yeah, more or less. I haven't used that term to describe it, but
yeah, I just found it today, but it occurred to me the other day, and I thought I would look it up because I thought it was an art movement or something, but it is actually in my philosophical dictionary, so it is an actual philosophical thing.
Yeah. Is that the end of the list?
That's the end of my list, yeah. Do you have other ones?
Well, no, I'm just going to jump in and say that something that I noticed is that some of the things you mentioned are traditionally conceived of as metaphysical theories, which I find to be interesting because I often find that many metaphysical theories, like their problem is that they assume it's metaphysical rather than epistemological. like idealism. That it's like we don't have a direct access to the object. That's like an epistemological point. But then they try to cast that in metaphysical terms.
Well, I think we already answered this. You can't really disentangle metaphysics from epistemology.
Yeah, they like circle in on themselves, because to make any claim about metaphysics, you have to know it epistemologically, right? So it's not the same thing. I don't want to say that, but yeah, it gets hard.
It's just that whenever people come forward with this weird metaphysical theory, it's just them assuming that some epistemological problem is indicative of some sort of metaphysical thing. Like, again, like idealism, or I guess Platonism is just projecting our mental representations onto like some abstract reality or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like almost like you're saying that your model that you came up with encompasses now the entire world or something like that, like the entire universe. Like, I came up with this idea that that the most fundamental thing for me are ideas, and so I'm an idealist. But now I'm gonna say that the entire world just consists of ideas or something like that. Like, it's...
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think idealism is an epistemological theory. Like, knowledge is going to depend on properties of the subject, which is what we're calling metaphysics, right? Like, the inescapable properties of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And knowledge is going to depend on empirical content, or, the data of experience. So It seems to me that these are all ways of defining the relation between the subject and an idea and reality. Right? They all define some kind of relationship between those things. Except for naive realism, which sort of ignores the distinction between the representation and reality and just says, well, they correspond, so they're basically the same thing. Idealism says there's no reality, there's just ideas and the subject. Platonism is the ideas exist in a Platonic realm, and our knowing is really just remembering these things or finding them in this realm.
Yeah, it's
Materialism, I guess, is like the idea that we can reduce all knowledge to simple facts about matter and motion.
Right, and it's also like this idea of emergence, right? That life emerges out of dead stuff, and then consciousness emerges from alive stuff, but it's all, at the bottom of it, it's all just atoms or whatever.
Yeah, well, I mean, I believe that, but I think that the criticism I've made in the past of materialism is that it ignores order. You can't say that everything is matter and motion, because there has to be something else. There has to be some order to reality, but also some order to the subject.
But see, this order thing is almost like, I would put that into in the metaphysical realm, where then I would say we can't say anything about that because we don't have access to the metaphysical. We can just...
Well, what I would say is we can't avoid assuming order of some kind.
Yeah, right. We can just make assumptions about that.
Well, it's not like an assumption. It's sort of built into the way we... Like, you can't talk without assuming order. You can't think or talk.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I agree with you. But like, we can't say where it comes from.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, we can't ultimately get beyond ourselves and answer those questions in some kind of objective way. But I mean, like, you don't have to assume a Platonic realm to have ideas about knowledge, but you do have to assume order.
Right.
Knowledge implies regularity or order, because without that, there's no prediction.
Yeah, sure. Continuity of consciousness, of knowledge, of memories, of all of that stuff.
Yeah. Regularity of the subject and the object.
Yeah.
Maybe we should go through them one at a time. I'm just going back over them. And
well, the only one that I'm really interested in at this point is pragmatism, but sure, we can go through all of them.
Well, maybe we can just give a brief argument against each one of these until the one that I believe in, and then we'll stop right there.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, we already sort of gave the basic argument against naive realism. So do you want to start with idealism? State of the Nile, you made an argument against that, which I agree with.
Yeah, sure. I can repeat it here. In my video, I said that I think that objective reality is the best explanation for certain qualities that our sensory experience has. So our sensory experience has like this quality of what you could call persistence. So I can't really manipulate the things I interact with in the world with my mind. And the same way that I can manipulate like an idea. So I can't just walk through a chair or something. I'm experiencing it. It's there. It's kind of being imposed on me. The next point would be that my expectations about experiences can be violated. So I can have certain ideas about what I will experience, but then something completely out of left field happens, and I don't see it coming. So the question is, how do you explain this? Why is sensory experience like this? And the idea is that sensory experience is representative of a reality that is external to the mind. It's like a physical reality that's external to the mind. So then our expectations, which are basically our beliefs, they are not, this reality is not contingent on our expectations or any of our beliefs or anything like that. If idealism is true, then you expect your expectations to define the reality. If you go into a room expecting something, then why would you ever be surprised to find something?
Unless, of course, you are encompassed in a greater mind, right? In God's mind, for example, and He is just simulating your stuff. So that is how you can basically try to make an argument for God from idealism.
But I think that's more like Platonism, though, like that triad.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess the God of Christianity would be more compatible with idealism than Platonism. But
really?
But yeah, sure. You can have all sorts of flavors and.
But how is it compatible with idealism? Because if that, like, in that theory, what substitutes for reality is God's mind. So your ideas are not reality. So it's just like another way of saying objective reality. Like God is objective reality.
Yeah. So God is. So remember, the metaphysics that means that this is the fundamental level, and so that means that God is the fundamental level of existence, and He is just within His mind, because He is, after all, He is like a disembodied mind. He is like simulating you and the world, and I guess maybe you could say He's creating the world, but at the fundamental level, it's just His mind. And
what exactly would be the distinction then, like, that we could actually discern? Because this is just making a whole bunch of assumptions. When I
I totally agree with you, and that's why I say that we cannot prefer one metaphysical theory over another, because we don't have access to the metaphysical realm.
Well, I don't agree with that.
So it doesn't really it doesn't really mean that you can dismiss this or that. It's just that this is an idea that follows us, and that people will refer to and say, "Oh no, look, we are all like born out of God's mind," or something like that.
Yeah, well, the problem with that is I think we can make a distinction. It's just by pointing out that my theory of objective reality doesn't make needless assumptions. Like mine just posits that there is a physical world that exists external to the mind. That's it. Then once you start bringing in God, you start asking questions about what exactly is this God? Why is it consciousness? why is it the Christian God specifically? And just
sure, but just to clarify there, like it seems to me like you invoke this Occam's razor type idea, which would be a conceptual. That would be in the conceptual realm, but the metaphysical realm like doesn't basically give a fuck about your Occam's razor. Like the metaphysical realm is just whatever it is.
Well, that's exactly why.
It just does what it does.
Well, so that's exactly why metaphysics is so problematic, and when
I understand that.
Go wild.
But I'm just trying to say what the distinction is.
I don't think that you can fit the Christian worldview into idealism, and I'll just give the reason why. That has nothing to do with Occam's razor or God. It's just that in that worldview, there is still a distinction between ideas that are in the human mind and the ideas in God's mind, and humans are capable of error, right? Mm-hmm. So I see that as being much more analogous to Platonism than to idealism, which is basically just throwing away the subject-object distinction by throwing away objectivity and saying that it is all mind and that there's no need to posit reality that is separate from consciousness or subjectivity. And so I agree with the refutation of idealism. I mean, it's refuted by our experiences of things like surprise and confusion, that we feel that we're wrong about, and that we certainly don't feel that we have control over the world. We just feel like we have very limited abilities to control it. And for the most part, it does whatever it does, right? So we certainly don't feel like we're creating this as we perceive it or by thinking it. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with the criticism of idealism. I'm just curious how you would apply that to the multiverse version of this.
I guess the multiverse, I would just criticize. Well, like, which version are we talking about here? Aren't there multiple versions of multiverse? It's like justifications.
There are many multiverses.
There's multiverses.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So, the version I'm thinking of is the reality is created by perceiving it. So every possible event happens, but we are one path through the multiverse. This of course seems to make action meaningless. It seems to make knowledge meaningless in a way. Because if everything happens, then what is prediction?
I don't think you need multiverses to make action and knowledge meaningless.
Well, okay, fair enough. We'll get to nihilism in a bit, but I mean...
okay.
So the one I'm thinking of is the one I discussed with Eric Orwell. As we go through our existence, our consciousness is an objectivity. So there's no distinction between objectivity and subjectivity, except there's a distinction between the multiverse and the universe. And the universe is your path through the multiverse. The path of your consciousness.
Yeah. For some reason, you ended up in this particular corner.
I have critiqued that before as just being sort of empirically vacuous and thus meaningless. But
but I think you raise a good point. Like it's almost impossible to critique it at that point, right? Like if you say that God has the multiverse in his mind, and you have
God is the multiverse and I am one path through it, kind of thing.
Yeah, and you are like in this one like neuron of his, and he has like a billion neurons. Yeah, like that's why I say that the metaphysic thing is just like it's interesting to talk about and stuff like that, and maybe you can like draw conclusions from a particular assumption, but you can never really get at that fundamental level.
Oh yeah, no. We're not going to be able to get outside of some frame and criticize these things outside of a frame. And
yeah. Yeah.
So in a way, we're picking a frame, which I guess is representationalism, and we're criticizing these from that perspective as inadequate. And somebody who is in that frame might see them as adequate because they're in that frame.
Yeah.
Anyway, did you have anything to add to that one?
Well,
Stephen?
yeah. The more general critique I have of most metaphysical theories is that it's just speculative. Like, I think we have it right when we say that, well, sure, there's order to the universe, but we're not going to really speculate beyond that. So, yeah, I balk at coming up with these more elaborate theories that are unfalsifiable, that we can't really verify one way or another.
I think Eric's defense that I can understand is that it's cleaner. You don't have these loose ends.
Well, in one way it's cleaner, but in another way it's like...
I know. In another way it's messier.
It's not just
negates,
whatever, yeah.
Yeah, I know, I agree. I don't think that it's justifiable to postulate a multiverse to get rid of the constants of physics or initial conditions or anything else like that. But anyway, okay, so I think that's probably enough for idealism. Platonism. Meat, do you want to give your version of this, or because I thought that this is where I'm confused now, because I thought that the Christian apologetics stuff, N.J. Dyer stuff, was kind of based on this assumption, these metaphysical assumptions that modus ponens, your favorite example, is out there in the mind of God, and that the mind of God is kind of like the Platonic realm, and it's distinct from the material world. And it's also distinct from the mind of man. That was what I thought your view was.
Right. Well, the distinction, I guess the most important one, is that God is personal, whereas Platonic realm is not personal. And so you have immediately this problem of how do we communicate with this realm of ideas. And so it's very important for Christians to have a personal God, and so they are immediately put off by the impersonal Platonic realm of ideas. But other than that, yeah, sure, you can use that as to explain Christianity, for example.
Well, in your view, like, what is the epistemology of Christianity, or J. Dyer's version of it?
Right. So I guess in that case, the orthodox version of epistemology would be that God is connected to his creation, especially, of course, to human beings, through this faculty that we have, that is the nous, or the spirit, or the eye of the soul, I guess. Which we have alongside with our mind and our bodies, and we can kind of get an inclination of God's mind, I guess, where all of these good things like the modus ponens and the laws of logic and whatever else are embedded in. So we have access to those eternal truths because he made us in his image. Something like that.
So how does the Christian epistemology explain error and the limitations of human knowledge, like, that we're acquiring knowledge progressively, we're learning more about the world as we go along? Like the apparently empirical nature of knowledge, how is that explained?
Yeah, of course, because we are now in this fallen state. After the fall, we have now entered the material realm that is just, I don't know, more hostile to us or something like that. Like it obviously it doesn't have a real explanation. It's just that
Like, as I was criticizing you when we were having those debates, I would say something like, well, how do you get modus ponens from God's mind, but you can't get how to ride a bike from God's mind? You have to go out and fall over 17 times and skin your knees and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's basically, from what I understand, and whatever, Jay Dyer probably has a better answer than me, but my answer is, from what I understand, is it's really just that we sinned and we fell, and now deal with the problem of induction, basically.
It's interesting that the problem of induction arises out of our fallen nature. That's kind of
yeah, it really is, because it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with being fallen, like being in this state. It's just that like you can't expect the same thing to happen in the future. Like it's yeah. I guess I think I understand what you mean, but
well, it's also kind of interesting that the fallen state comes from eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge.
Yeah, which was before they knew what was right and what was wrong, right? So how were they supposed to know that it was wrong to go against God's command if they haven't eaten the fruit of right and wrong or whatever?
Yeah, ignorance was bliss, right?
Yeah, right. So
I don't know. It's a weird story. It's kind of interesting, but. Okay.
Well, yeah, but you could pick it apart, but like,
yeah, I know.
who cares?
I don't think anybody today, except maybe some.
No, there are actually, I think, a couple of like mathematicians who, and maybe physicists or something, but
who think that mathematics and mathematical laws, physical laws, things like that exist in some realm that is not.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not built into the subject, and it's not in the material world. It's in some other realm.
Right. Well, obviously, it's not in the material world. Like you don't find the E equals MC squared or whatever it's called. Right. You don't find that equation in the material world. Mm-hmm. It has to be, in a sense, outside of it, but it is an interesting question. Why is mathematics so applicable to reality in some sense, right? What is up with that? Like,
no, it's a good question. I mean, I think, well, this would probably get off on a big tangent.
Yeah. No, I'm not like I didn't mean to. Lead into that subject, but I'm just saying that it's not obvious why it works so well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just going to say we should have a discussion about mathematics sometime, specifically.
Yeah, we can table this and have a discussion about mathematics, the philosophy of mathematics or whatever. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it, though. There's some crackling or something coming from somebody.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm messing around with the bag here. I'm kind of snacking. But something I could add is that I do have like a site where they actually surveyed a bunch of philosophers, and they asked them about the divide between Platonism and nominalism. Mm-hmm. And it's basically like an even split, with maybe like 20% is neither, but it's like 40% of philosophers are Platonists. And the other 40 are nominalists. And
what is nominalism then?
Nominalism, they just deny the existence of abstractions as these objects that exist outside of the mind.
So let's not call them philosophers really, but academic philosophers are saying that those are the alternatives?
Well, I'm not satisfied with it, but more or less, like there were three options. It was like Platonism, nominalism, then other. I don't know what the other entails.
Otherism.
Yeah, just nominalism doesn't really seem to go into enough detail about the subject and how we represent things in the mind. You know, they're just getting into a disagreement over the existence of objective abstractions. That's basically it.
But objective abstractions are order, basically. I mean, an abstraction is some order that is in experience that can be extracted from it and then applied back to it. And so laws of nature are abstractions, and if there weren't some correlates to those in reality, then they wouldn't be predictive, right? They wouldn't work.
Are you saying that this order is something that like exists outside of space and time? And
I'm not saying it exists outside of, because outside of is a term that it's a spatial metaphor, right?
Yeah.
That's a good point, yeah.
I mean, I think order is a presupposition of any epistemology.
Yeah, I guess Platonists argue that these abstractions that exist objectively, they are outside of space and time. The nominalists claim that's impossible.
I don't, but see, the whole Platonic thing is more than just abstractions exist outside of space and time. It's this idea that we have the ability to get into this other realm mentally.
Yeah, but this is never explained in Platonism, though.
Yeah, this is like the primary nominalist
that is the
criticism.
Yeah, this is the primary problem with Platonism, that you never get the explanation of how the material realm is able to connect to kind of communicate with the realm of ideas.
Yeah, I think this is like an example of a bad metaphor. Like, it's like trying to take causality out of the material world and then put it somewhere else, and then you have to figure out how does this other realm of causality cause the material world.
Right.
Like, it's tearing these things apart. It's like, I don't know, I can't think of a good analogy, but it's like trying to remove shape from an object. You know, it just doesn't make sense. I think it's just nonsensical.
Which I guess then was Aristotle's point, that he tried to instantiate all of the properties of an object within the object, instead of in some Platonic realm, right? So like you could say that Aristotle was like the scientist kind of guy, right? He was the beginning of the empiricist kind of school. And
well, could we argue that perhaps this would be like a distinction between like an immanent theory of abstractions and then a transcendental theory of abstractions? You know, like immanent would be kind of just within everything.
And transcendental would place them somewhere
above it, you know, greater than.
I don't think this is a resolvable question, because I'm not sure we have the ability to think in a frame that would answer, or that would allow us to not just answer the question, but pose the right question, because we cannot think without presupposing order. There's a sense in which order is above, metaphorically, above the material world, which is that if you go from one place to another, the laws of physics are the same, so the laws of physics must be, you know, above any specific individual part of the world. All that says is that there is order to the world. That's all it says. There's order to the world, and there's order to our representations of the world. And when the order of those two things is aligned, or when one of them captures some of the regularity of the other, then that is truth. But
yeah.
I don't think we can go beyond that to, like, I think these speculations about where do you put order are kind of, I think there's a kind of conceptual error in doing that. Because you're conceiving of order as if it was like an object.
Yeah, that's true.
As if it was something that could be extricated from matter or from reality, and vice versa.
Yeah, it's almost like the ontological argument for God, right? Where you say the most perfect being must exist or something like that.
You're trying to turn me into a Christian even now.
well, well, I've never tried any of these on you. I've stuck to the tag, right? So I still got some tricks in my pocket.
Ah, I see.
So maybe next time.
Yeah, it is a kind of ontological assumption that order exists.
Yeah.
We're adding in all the different ologies and isms and things. We've got metaphysics, epistemology, ontology, psychology, all stuck together.
Yeah. Where it's like hard to distinguish between, is it just a property of reality, or is this a thing that exists in reality?
But if it's a thing, then you would have to create some other kind of order that relates that thing to something else, and that's where I think it's incoherent, like fundamentally incoherent. Because once you have that Platonic realm in which order exists independent of the material world, then you need to posit some other kind of order that relates the material world to that other realm, and that itself would not be in
and that is the problem of Platonism, that they don't have a way of relating the material realm to the idealism realm, or the idea realm, or whatever.
So we've squashed Platonism. All right, that's good.
Okay.
What about materialism?
I think it's just I can just say that they try too hard to cut out the subject and just focus in on what's obvious. So it almost is kind of like an extension of naive realism almost, because they just think that what we can see is what exists, and that's all that really matters. And they're trying to make it more sophisticated, but they still ignore the subject.
Now that I'm thinking of it, is it possible that naive realism is basically just like methodological materialism, whereas materialism is metaphysical materialism? Like where you say all we can, like the naive realism says all we can explore is material, whereas the materialist says no, not only what we can explore is material, but all that exists is material, where he makes a metaphysical claim. Is that the only distinction?
I think that the main distinction is that the naive realist doesn't even ask the question. Like the naive realist just takes for granted that observation works, thought works, logic works, induction works.
Right. Hence the naive.
Yeah. Whereas the materialist, if such a person exists, I don't know if anybody actually claims to be a materialist, but
there are definitely people who call themselves materialists. Yeah.
Okay, because I've only seen this used as a pejorative label attached.
Yeah. I know. We've talked about this the last time, and after that, I went and looked at like the academic philosophers, and there are materialists. It's not only apologetics tactics.
So people actually call themselves materialists.
Yeah. It's actually like this David Chalmers, I think. Do you know about him?
No.
He came up with this zombie idea, which is actually kind of interesting. Oh, maybe it's also like actually relevant to the topic. Where he says, like, can you imagine a zombie, which is basically a human being that doesn't have consciousness? Like, it does all the same things. The only difference is it doesn't have consciousness.
Well, that's a way of framing the hard problem of consciousness.
Right. Yeah. That comes from this dude. He came up with this basically.
Okay. Yeah, but that's a question of, can you get rid of the subject? Basically. Right. That seems a little bit different from materialism. But
well, in a sense, it would just mean that there isn't anything extra, right? like you like you say, oh, I'm seeing the color red, but in reality, we can just like cut open your brain and look at the like connections at the neurons within your brain and say, oh, his seeing the color red just means that these neurons are firing, something like that. Like you translate it into a different language or something like that.
Right. So he's saying that you could translate because all subjective experiences have objective correlates. You could, in theory, translate all subjective experiences into those objective correlates, and then subjectivity would disappear in a puff of translation.
Yeah, so that is a kind of reductionism that would correspond to materialism, because materialism reduces everything to the basic building blocks or whatever.
I guess that's not what I thought it was, but I don't know. Maybe that's a better way of thinking about it. Because I'm just going to look it up in my philosophical dictionary that I found on the bus, like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I know that.
Right. Is it like from the 1920s? Maybe you should get an updated.
You're making boomer jokes at my expense. Okay, hold on.
Well,
it was published 1979. It's not too bad.
Well, I don't know. I actually don't know if much happened in terms of like progress. But
probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I know that materialism isn't just metaphysics; it's also just philosophy of mind, and they are connected, of course.
Yeah.
So
we have one more thing we have to throw in here: philosophy of mind. Sorry, go ahead. I'm just babbling.
Oh well, something that's interesting is that philosophy of mind. That's another thing that people always frame in terms of metaphysics, when I think that it's more correct to look at things in terms of knowledge, epistemology. So like they're trying to, well, the thing we're trying to explain here is, why is the mind and the brain perceived as different? Because the mind is the more subjective, personal, and then the brain is the empirical. And of course, philosophy of mind, the dualists at the very least, they go and they try to claim that this implies some sort of metaphysical claim. There's the mental substance, and then there's the physical substance. There's two different substances that make up the nature of reality.
Okay, so let me just quickly give the counterpoint to that. You can't say subjectivity is a substance, because a substance is by definition objective.
Right.
Like once you try to reduce subjectivity to objectivity, you've lost subjectivity. But
right.
The feeling of something is not the same as neurons firing or an image on the retina or whatever, right? There's no way to get the subjective experience into the. That
is the common argument against materialism, that it's not the same thing.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I don't want to get too much into it. It's just that the thing that seems to be missing from it is order. So that was my criticism of it, which is that regardless of the subject-object distinction, there's also a matter-order distinction.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah,
okay,
the order cannot really be explained in terms of materialism.
Yeah. Anyway, but I think we can let this one lie for now. I think we've covered enough of it.
Okay, are we at pragmatism yet?
Yeah. But I just wanted to mention, before I forget, I just remembered there's one other one that I added while we were talking.
Okay.
Social constructivism.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I'm an expert at this now, since I've read like the first 3 chapters of the book.
You could even add to that relativism, but
yeah.
But let's do pragmatism, because you're dying to get into that. So
I'm really interested in pragmatism in the sense that I don't really understand what the objection to pragmatism is, because I understand that you can say, well, okay, this stuff works, but you gotta know how the stuff works in order to know.
Okay, well, I'll give my objection to it, and then
Yeah.
you can tell me if you think it's inadequate or whatever.
Okay.
All right. So pragmatism is the idea that truth is a matter of functionality, right? If it works, it's true. If it doesn't work, it's false.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that's the basic idea. So this is an attempt to get truth out of value. And in an objective sense, so I would say objectively, you could say that, yeah, truth, when I'm like, say I'm looking at another organism, like an alien being, I can say, well, it has this model in its head, and the model works for the alien, so I'm going to call that truth. But from my perspective as a subject, I cannot use that definition of truth. Because to make a judgment about whether something is functional, I have to make judgments of truth. So there's an infinite regress that has no bootstrapping. Like, let's say I said, well, I'm going to believe in God because God will, I don't know, will make me reproduce. Well, how do I know that believing in God is going to make me reproduce? That's a truth claim, right? There's this endless regress of functionality.
I understand the point, but how do you escape the infinite regress in your
well, induction? Because you're not deriving it deductively from something. You're deriving it inductively. Induction is a way of getting models of reality from data. But appealing to pragmatism as a justification for belief is just an infinite regress, because any claim you're going to make about something being functional is itself a truth claim and would then have to be justified on the grounds of its functionality, which would then be another truth claim, which would then have to be justified on the grounds of its functionality.
Right, but you've got like this huge you've got this past experience, right, which you can draw from, and so you're not justifying it. Like, okay, you can say it's an infinite regress because who knows how far the experience goes, but you can always refer to like just the last day, like on Monday this worked, and on Sunday this worked, and on Saturday this worked, and so you are always referring to
but
just
how do you know?
limited.
How do you know it worked?
Well, because it worked last time.
No, but in what sense did it work? That's a truth claim.
It worked. It worked in the sense that it satisfied your needs.
How do you know it satisfied your needs? I mean, how do you even know it happened? That's a truth claim. Are you still there?
Yeah. I'm thinking about it. I mean, do you necessarily need to go into the weeds like that?
Well, if you're claiming
to establish, no. But look. The whole point of pragmatism is that you take a different route, right? You don't do this thing like, okay, State of the Nile. Maybe you remember we talked about this once, but I think Richard Rorty, or maybe not Richard, whatever, but some dude who was like a kind of half pragmatist, half postmodernist, half whatever. He thought that our entire language was at fault. That our language was like presupposing that there is a world and there is us, so subject-object distinction, and so our language had a kind of built-in Platonism, which he wanted to get rid of, and he thought, no, it's just the situation itself is what's happening. It's like there isn't a truth claim in and of itself, divorced from the context, but there's always, like, I don't know, there is you, there is the world, there is the context, there is a language, and all of that tied together in a ball or whatever, in a knot, and that is what pragmatism is. Like, it's supposed to go against the preconceived notion of how do you know that is true? How do you know that is true? Like, it's true because it's true or something. I don't know.
Well, like I remember his definition of truth was this. It was truth is whatever your contemporaries let you get away with. That was it.
Yeah, sure. Like, it's supposed to be different. It's not like the point is.
Well, I think Blithering Genius's point is that you're still making truth claims. You're presupposing the different form of truth when you're trying to establish pragmatism. Like,
no, sure,
let me just get this out. I think pragmatism. No, I think that pragmatism, it doesn't work in like an ultimate theory of truth sense. However, when we're talking about creating models of like an existing experience, perhaps that's where you could start looking at things in more pragmatist terms.
Sure,
you can't think about it in an ultimate sense, but when we start like modeling things, then you can kind of get away with perhaps arguing about from utility.
No, I understand, but like I'm now almost like I'm now forced into this position of a presuppositionalist Christian who says, no, look at your presupposition, look at what you're presupposing here, because you're saying it's not suitable for like a real theory of truth or for a real theory of knowledge, but you are presupposing these specific parameters. Like, I don't know what to call them.
Yeah,
but like,
I think I know what you're saying. I mean, what you're saying is, hey, look, if the pragmatist is still alive at the end of the day, you have no argument. Well, but the pragmatist in that case is kind of a nihilist then. About knowledge, anyway.
What I'm saying is that you're not allowed to use your particular theory to judge his theory. You're supposed to like.
But that's the only thing you can do.
Jump into his theory and then judge it internally, like from the inside.
Okay, but you still can't do that. Okay, so as a subject, how does the pragmatist decide whether something is true? He has to decide whether it worked. So I'm in his mind. I'm the pragmatist. I'm trying to decide whether.
No. From the pragmatist point of view, everything works.
Well, then it's a vacuous system because everything is true. Then.
Right, everything is true but some. Right, because there is no value in that system.
But let's say I accept the pragmatist value system.
No, there is no value.
Of course there are values. I mean, pragmatism is based on values. It's saying something like, it's always based on some implicit or explicit value system, like reproducing is the purpose of life, or seeking pleasure is the purpose of life. And then the pragmatist says, well, I believe in this because believing in it makes me happy. Or I believe in this because believing in it, it makes me have more kids, or whatever their value assumptions are. They're trying to justify their truth claims on the basis of their value assumptions alone.
I'm just gonna disagree with you. Okay, I'm just gonna argue against you now.
Okay.
So I'm gonna say that no, that's wrong. The pragmatist is just saying whatever I'm doing now is whatever's true and whatever I'm valuing the most, by definition. Well, I don't even know if he's gonna talk about value, but the point is that, like, you are just living your life and you are doing stuff, but it's not like you can abstract from your particular. Like, you're in a matrix or something like that, right? Not like in the movie Matrix, but you are like a knot in the world. Like the world is like this web of knots, I guess, and you are one of them. and you're just doing stuff and you're going along, and whatever you're doing, that is what you value, because that's what you're doing.
But this doesn't get at what is knowledge. Like,
Well,
if pragmatism is a
but
theory
maybe-
of knowledge, then it has to provide a basis for making a judgment about whether something is true or not.
No,
Right?
but
There has to be some
but
theory
you're
of-
just saying that. You're just saying that it has to. Why does it have to? Like, what are you? You are the knowledge police now. Like you
Well,
have
if it's-
you define what they have.
So that's why I said it's kind of, your version of it is more like nihilism, where you just deny anybody any frame in which there is meaning, or in which judgment is possible, or correct or incorrect or whatever. But I don't think that's what the term pragmatism means. Like, that's not what William James, like the pragmatists meant.
Yeah.
They didn't mean that just whatever I think is correct because I'm thinking it. They meant that you have to judge beliefs by their consequences. It was basically a kind of appeal to consequences epistemology.
But
And that's the way Jordan Peterson uses the term.
but
kind of appeal
but
to
that's still
consequences.
Yeah.
But you would still only be able to judge it after the fact, right? You couldn't, like, you're not making a prognosis into the future. You're just judging the past, how well the past fits with your preference.
But even that though, still, if you're saying the past, what I did in the past worked, you're making a truth claim about the past and about how a belief produced results. So you're making truth claims about what happened in the past and how it happened, and those truth claims would then in turn require justification, and the justification would then have to be that they're pragmatic. So it's an infinite regress. That's the criticism, that you cannot ground truth on value because value judgments depend on truth judgments.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But anyway, that's the criticism.
Why is that a criticism? Why is infinite regress a criticism?
Because it means you cannot use this appeal to consequences to actually arrive at a judgment. You cannot make truth judgments in this way. So it just isn't an approach that works. Like, you cannot, ironically, pragmatism doesn't work. You cannot use it to make judgments of truth, because you're always going to either beg the question or go off on an infinite regress. So there you go. I've out-pragmatized pragmatism.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. Okay. Well.
Well,
Okay.
we can fight this battle another time too. I mean, we don't have to solve everything. I know you
Yeah.
still want to pwn me. I know.
Well, no. I'm just like I like to go against the grain. Usually, and like, if somebody says, well, no, you have to fulfill these things for it to be a theory of truth, then I
Well,
sometimes
sure,
like to
those
say,
are.
well, no,
yeah,
why these, right? Why?
I get it, but obviously there would be no point having this discussion if we weren't making some kind of assumption about that, right? Like, 'cause there would be no discussion then.
Well,
So
yeah,
that's like
no,
that's why I said that's more like
understand.
nihilism, because it's just rejecting the entire frame of the discussion, and if and that is one of the approaches I listed, but
Right.
that isn't pragmatism. Pragmatism is a sort of consequentialist theory of knowledge. And I just wanted to say one thing about it, though. There were two things about it. One is that pragmatism is true as an objective theory of knowledge. It's just not true from your subjective perspective. Like, it's sort of true psychologically that evolutionarily we evolved to have representations that make us reproduce, and it doesn't ultimately matter whether they represent reality, accurately.
Right.
It only matters to the extent that they help us to reproduce. So in that sense, I'm a pragmatist. But in a philosophical sense, where the condition of the subject is taken into account, I'm not a pragmatist because I cannot use that method myself. And it does not describe how my brain makes truth judgments. My brain obviously does not make truth judgments based on value judgments, because there is no way for it to do that. So even though in the long run evolution will select us to have the beliefs that work, from our position as subjects, we have to make judgments based on some other grounds. So this is one example where philosophy and psychology kind of get distinguished. And I think that's why Peterson makes this error, because he's coming at it as a psychologist. He's not coming at it as a philosopher.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
All right, but we'll refight that another time. Okay, so we've got social constructivism, nihilism, and finally the ultimate truth, representationalism.
Can I do the social constructionism one? Just because I didn't contribute to this last one.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
All right. So social constructionism, at least within epistemology, is this idea that our theories about reality are determined primarily by, I guess you could call them arbitrary social forces, and perhaps ideology, culture, just any sort of social aspects, rather than the actual natural world that we're trying to represent. So this is most commonly applied to theories about human nature, usually. Perhaps if someone comes up with a theory of human nature, they'll make the claim that certain ideological assumptions about human beings, about our nature, invariably influence how we construct our models of human behavior itself, and then that leads to false conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that would be the position. My criticism would be that, well, somewhat ironically, they assume a false dichotomy. It goes back to what we were talking about before about the natural kind, conventional kind distinction. So a social constructionist, they will claim that our theory has certain kinds in it that are purely conventional. So they're arbitrary, ideological, rather than something that exists in the natural world. So my point would be that that's a false dichotomy. It's they incorrectly assume that if they can demonstrate that a particular kind, like race, is somewhat arbitrary, then it categorically makes it arbitrary rather than natural, and then they use that to dismiss it as a social construct. If it's arbitrary, then it's a social construct. If it's natural, then it's actually true.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's basically the gist of it.
So it's basically
my point would be
like
that
a naturalistic fallacy built in there. Like the natural things are good.
Well, I wouldn't say
They
that.
are real.
I wouldn't say that. Like the problem is that they assume that that this dichotomy exists, and if something's somewhat arbitrary, then you can just completely change it. So they might argue that again, race doesn't exist because it's somewhat arbitrary how many racial groupings there are. Or they might argue that the sex binary or the gender binary doesn't exist because some random ass tribe in the middle buttfuck nowhere is the exception to the rule.
Yeah, sure.
And
but
again,
then they're
the problem
gonna
is
argue in favor of like affirmative action in the next breath.
I guess I don't really want to get into like the whole the political aspect of it.
Oh, right. I get you. Okay, let's keep it abstract and philosophical. Okay,
Well,
so
it is fair to point out though that it is usually used in a certain kind of way, right? In a kind of hypocritical way to attack somebody else's beliefs as just social constructs.
Yeah, and like they contradict themselves. Like they're always
it's
deny binaries and claim that they're socially constructed. But then the only way they can do that is by assuming a binary themselves, the natural conventional binary. So just the point is that things are more or less natural and more or less conventional as a matter of degree. and you can determine this through explanatory and predictive power. And yeah, just trying to declare things arbitrary is.
Would you lump this into pragmatism or idealism, if you had to lump it?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, it talks purely about how we construct models and use them to represent experience, but then so that, I guess, would kind of relate to idealism, because these people, they're always talking about how we're trapped within language and how these inform our thinking. So I guess it's an idealist theory in that sense. Maybe not in the sense that reality itself is the mind, but our understanding of reality is completely mediated by the mind to such an extent that no theory is more correct than the other. I guess that would be the strong form.
Yeah, they kind of seem to switch back and forth. And when I say they, I mean the typical left-wing postmodernist type person.
What you just said made me think of, is idealism, what's the word? Like are you, do the ideas come from within or from the outside, kind of thing?
Well,
are you in charge of the ideas, or do the ideas just like flow over you?
in that frame, it doesn't make sense to ask the question. But because
Right.
if you can't distinguish subject and object, then I mean you can't make those kinds of statements, because those are statements about the subject and the object relation. Like, do you control it? Do you as a subject control this thing as an object?
Yeah.
Right. So, but oh shoot, I wanted to say something about the. Oh yeah. So one thing about the social constructivists that is kind of interesting is that they often critique the notion of the subject as kind of meaningless, and they have this other notion of the intersubjectivity.
Oh, yeah.
So they have this other layer, right? The social layer, which is actually important. Like, I'm not completely dismissing everything within that space. I'm just,
It's a web.
Yeah, there are interesting ideas that are in there that are worth thinking about.
Yeah.
So they kind of reject the idea of this subject, independent subject, and they talk about things being intersubjectively constructed. Where they fall down is that they don't say how this relates to reality, except in a sort of question-begging way, like, well, it's in pursuit of power or something like that. When it's an idea I don't like, but they sort of reject that subject-object distinction, or they have another distinction, which is the subject and the intersubjective web or whatever. I don't know what to call it. Anyway, I don't know.
It's like knowledge is socially constructed, essentially.
Yeah, knowledge is socially constructed, and it's like it's collaboratively constructed, not individually constructed, and reality is performed, as a sort of play, and like they have all these concepts about
performativity.
How subjects are relating not to objective reality, but to society, to like the web of other minds.
Like this idea, this whatever it is, notion is just so modern or postmodern or whatever. Like, because I'm just drawing the distinction between like something like Platonism, right? Which was you could have it was an ancient idea, and you can still apply it today if you want. And I guess as State of the Nile pointed out, 40% of philosophers still hold to Platonism. But this bullshit, like this social constructionism, that could only arise in modernity, because people are like, we can't like we have too much time on our hands or something like that. Like I'm not saying.
I don't think that's a fair criticism.
No, look,
because
okay,
like
okay. I was just about to say I'm not saying that there is nothing useful to derive from this, but it is definitely like something self-centered about this, like something. We are the ones who are like ascribing roles to people or something like that. Like we are.
In a way, it kind of turns Platonism on its head, because it says rather than this Platonic realm existing independent of us, we're actively constructing it. I mean, I'm rationalizing it a lot more than it's usually presented, right? I'm trying to give a more coherent view of it. But if you try to create a coherent view out of this, there's some truth to this idea that we act into this realm of culture.
Of course we do.
These... Yeah,
and I understand it much better now that and I'm not completely through the book, but now that I read the Social Construction of What, at least the first couple of chapters of it, but still it's like it has this stench of modernism about it, like
the stench of modernism. That should be
Yeah.
the title of your next video, the stench of modernism.
Yeah. But no, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
So I take the notion of social construction seriously, and it is part of my epistemology, and culture is
Right.
real, and it is an analog to the Platonic realm. But it's not a top-down thing that's imposed on us. It's a bottom-up and top-down thing. There's a feedback loop between the individual and the culture, right? That you act into it, and it affects you. And we sort of we converge on shared concepts and beliefs, a shared language that does have this kind of independent existence from both the material world and us as individuals. Like money, right? Money is just something that we believe in, and it exists because we believe in it.
Yeah,
Social
but
reality,
basically memes.
Well, memes are cultural, but then things like money and marriage and laws and all that stuff are explicitly socially constructed. So there are these other realms of ideas that we create intersubjectively, and a complete epistemology has to take that into account. It can't just be the individual staring at the world, and some kind of atomized individual with no connection to culture or society.
Yeah.
But I don't believe in the crazy postmodernist hypocritical bullshit.
Right.
Sorry. Anyway, I took over more than I wanted to there. So State of the Nile, do you want to wrap that up?
Well, I think that you guys more or less summed everything up there. Well, actually, in the beginning, you did ask about whether it relates to pragmatism or idealism more. So I did talk about how it might relate to idealism, at least in the sense that it deals with a lot with how we construct ideas, or we formulate our ideas about our experiences. So it's not necessarily that they deny reality, but that we just have all these different theories that are no more true than the other. And then it might relate to pragmatism, at least maybe perhaps through Richard Rorty. So what Meat brought up earlier. He was a pragmatist and a postmodernist. And like Meat was saying, he said that language permeates everything. So language and the concepts tied to language basically shapes how we perceive and conceptualize everything. And that led him to take a more pragmatist route. So I can see where you can go from a a very strong social constructionist perspective where no theory is more correct than the other, and then say, oh, then do whatever works. Perhaps in a political sense or a personal sense. There's my thoughts.
All right, so we wrapped up social constructivism. Now nihilism. Who wants to take that one? Should I take that one?
Yeah, I think you should take the nihilism.
Fine, I get nihilism. Well, nihilism is pretty easy, I guess, because it's just refusing to have a theory. It's just an attitude. It's not a theory. And so I listed it here as a theory of knowledge, but it's really a non-theory. It's a refusal to define a theory because the nihilist's attitude toward this enterprise is one of futility. Like, this is pointless. Or it's absurd. Like, I cannot, the nihilist might say I cannot know anything. But the nihilist even doesn't believe that he knows that, if he's a consistent nihilist. So the nihilist attitude toward knowledge is just shrug.
Okay, but isn't there also an endless regress built into nihilism, where you don't know that you don't know that you don't know that you don't know?
Well, they don't care about that, though.
But that's what I said, that he doesn't say that he doesn't know. He doesn't even make that claim. I mean, that's why it's just a shrug. It's just an attitude. It's just an emotional reaction. But it's the emotional... So you could say that the nihilist intellectually grasps the human condition of being trapped within subjectivity, and yet he emotionally rejects it. Grasping that idea makes him view life as absurd and knowledge as impossible or meaningless or whatever. So that's what nihilism is. It's at least this form, this ultimate form of nihilism.
Yeah.
It's an emotional rejection of knowledge, just based on having arrived at this view, or based on trying to find a foundation for knowledge and finding none. So if you struggle for years and years to find a foundation for knowledge and you don't find one, and you have this intuition that is essential, that without a foundation, knowledge is meaningless, then you're a nihilist.
Right, but it's almost like it's strange that you can become a nihilist. Like you didn't always used to be a nihilist, but then suddenly at one point you became a nihilist. Like, what was before that? Like,
well, it's like any of these things. It comes out of philosophical inquiry, right? I mean, you have to be philosophical to get to any of these positions, other than naive realism.
Yeah, but isn't it almost like a contradiction if philosophical inquiry led you to be a nihilist?
Not really. It's not a contradiction. It's just that you don't have an answer, right? You have skepticism, but you have no positive beliefs.
Okay, but so I'm picturing, like, I am being like a philosophical, like I'm inquiring philosophically, and I have all of these roads, like all of these paths in front of me, like whatever, Platonism, idealism, nihilism is one of them. Isn't, like, it just seems strange to me that nihilism is just equivalent to all of the other ones.
Well, it's not exactly, because it isn't a theory of knowledge, but I included it there because it contrasts with them, right? And it's a possible end point of your philosophical inquiry. Like, you can say that the moment before, or maybe at the moment of saying cogito ergo sum, or whatever Descartes is supposed to have said, he was a nihilist. So it's like a state of mind that you have acquired the ability to doubt everything. You have eliminated all of your assumptions, or at least you have brought them all into consciousness, questioned them, and said to yourself, well, I don't know that for sure. I can't trust that for sure. I no longer have faith in this. So once you arrive at that position, then you're basically a nihilist at that point. Now, can you maintain that state of mind? I don't know. I don't think so, but maybe.
It's like a fleeting state of mind. It's
In a way, Zen Buddhism is a religion of nihilism.
Oh yeah.
there's no answer, but you're not even saying there's no answer. So, yeah, it's not like any of the others. It's not a theory, but it is a state of mind that you arrive at by doubting your assumptions and casting them away. And then you arrive at this state of being completely naked in the abyss, or floating in the abyss.
So is that the only one that's is that preferable? Is that the one that's the right path to take, since we can't know for sure?
Well, of course you couldn't say it's the right path to take, because that would be a value judgment and a truth judgment. Right. You have no basis for making those. So the nihilist has no basis for being a nihilist.
But at least you don't assume that... Well, yeah, right. But you would still assume that you're right in taking the nihilist path, right? So
no, I think if you're I mean, who is really a nihilist? I don't know. But I think at the moment, if you're in a true nihilist state of mind, then you would not think that being a nihilist is right. Mm-hmm. You would just be there. It's just something you could be. It's not something you could necessarily believe. A long time ago, I wrote this. I think I actually made a video about it too, but it was probably better to read it. The Nihilist and the Carpenter.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you read that. It's a story about... Yeah, so in that story, the point of that story is that there are no implications that come from nihilism, right? You could be a nihilist, and you could live in a house with a white picket fence, have 3 kids. That's just as compatible with nihilism as throwing yourself off a cliff.
Yeah.
So it has no implications.
But then again, aren't you just saying that nihilism is basically life? Like, who cares about all of these other labels?
Well, this is like the horseshoe theory of naive realism to nihilism. The difference is the journey, I guess. And probably it would affect you in various ways, but the main difference is that you have gone through this process of doubting your beliefs, of questioning your assumptions. So you don't take them for granted. The naive realist takes for granted the reality of his perceptions. Yeah. The nihilist doesn't. But the nihilist could still act just like the naive realist. He could still take them for granted in a non-philosophical way. Like in ordinary life, he's going to walk down the street. He's not going to walk into walls because he doesn't trust that his perceptions are giving him an accurate understanding of reality. He's still going to use them. But he has this additional philosophical kind of meta-awareness, right? He has this self-awareness of being in this condition of not having a foundation. The naive realist thinks he's standing on the ground, but he's floating in space or floating in the abyss.
Yeah.
The nihilist is in the same condition, but he doesn't think he's standing on the ground.
But then why aren't you satisfied with the label nihilist? You ask me what would you call my position? Why is a nihilist sufficient?
Well, because I do have a theory of knowledge. So I don't...
But you don't take it for granted, right?
No, I don't take it for granted. But my point is you have to get to nihilism before you can actually build up a philosophical worldview. You can't build it up with a bunch of unquestioned assumptions.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And once you get there, you're going to have a very different view of your... Like, you're still not going to believe you have a foundation. But...
Yeah, I don't know. Like this almost... makes me think of this blank slate idea, we all know now that we weren't born as blank slates, blah blah blah. But now what you're saying is almost makes me think like, well, we weren't born as blank slates, but we can make ourselves blank slates and then build on top of that.
Not really, no. I mean, it's not like you can make yourself into a blank slate. It's more like you can question all of your assumptions, but that's not the same as being a blank slate.
I think it's more like you recognize other theoretical frameworks and you can hop between them. So you're not just breaking down your beliefs. You're just stepping from one to another and seeing things from different perspectives and recognizing I guess it's somewhat relative.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, but well, almost like as a closing statement, I guess I could say that just I think that the most important thing is that you don't subscribe to one particular system, like
Well, I think it's more like
religiously, right, dogmatically. Like I think that it's important that you kind of stay afloat and that you kind of take all of these different options into account, and you don't say, well, no, I'm gonna be that one thing, or something like that.
yeah, like I've never singled out a particular position and staked out that position really.
Yeah.
Not religiously. I've always just picked and pulled from a wide range of sources because like we were talking about earlier, things they have kernels of truth to them. It's not like social constructionism is
right,
all right, all wrong. I mean, they have some points.
Right.
They just overemphasize.
Yeah, there are useful aspects to all of them, but it's probably a bad thing to say, I'm gonna look at the world through this particular lens.
Well, I don't think you can avoid doing that, though. You're always going to be looking at the world through a lens. You're always going to be looking at the world through a worldview. Even if your worldview allows for other worldviews and says that there's some truth to them, or they have some kernels of truth or whatever. If you find a kernel of truth in another worldview, it becomes part of your worldview. You can't escape from that.
Yeah, but like, if you say I'm gonna be this thing, then you preclude the other worldviews from allowing you to draw anything useful from them. Like you're saying, no, I'm gonna stick to my framework, and I'm not gonna allow anything else to come.
Yeah, but that's dogmatism. That's not allowing them into your consciousness as alternatives, right? There's a difference between rejecting something consciously, rationally, after you've thought about it, and rejecting something subconsciously, without thought, without giving it any, without evaluating it, without considering it, just saying, no, I'm not going to question this assumption. This is absolute.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking in terms of like people who are Christians, let's say, because that's what I'm familiar with, who say, I'm gonna stick to this dogma and I'm not gonna allow anything from the outside to enter my worldview.
Yeah, that's dogmatism, but that's not. Yeah. That's not. Like once you go down the philosophical road, that's anti-dogmatic because
philosophy. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, philosophy is really, and I would say rationality is basically accepting your autonomy of belief. So it's saying, oh yeah, I have to make this judgment myself. Nobody's forcing it on me. So I'm free to choose whether to believe in God or not to believe in God.
Yeah.
And I'm free to, develop my own theory of knowledge, and I'm free to question my own beliefs. I'm free to, it's basically expanding the box you think inside, which means making yourself more free to think.
But that's almost that's almost like a value judgment. Like you're saying, before you know what's true or what's good, you're saying, or I guess you're saying, being free is more good. It's better.
No, I'm not saying it's more good. I'm just saying that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is that it's going to be your predisposition to either think for yourself or to just rely on heuristics and assumptions.
Well, right, but I mean that people who took up philosophy decided that philosophy was worth it, but technically they would have to have made that choice before they knew any philosophy, and so it's a kind of ad hoc or whatever. It's a kind of arbitrary decision to take up philosophy before you know that philosophy is any good.
I think the way you end up getting into philosophy is not like that. It's not that you decide philosophy is good. It's that you discover a contradiction in your beliefs, or you discover some fundamental flaw.
Right, but why is
your
a
existing
contradiction
worldview.
bad? Why is a flaw bad?
Well, it just feels bad. I mean, it's just we all have that feeling, cognitive dissonance.
So it's
And some
ultimately
people,
comes down to feelings, like feelings over logic.
what I'm saying is, this is how it happens. Some people, when they discover a fundamental flaw in their beliefs, are going to seek new beliefs, and and some people are going to go to the effort to think for themselves because they just have that nature. Like when I was a kid, I discovered that morality made no sense, so I put a lot of effort into thinking about that, and eventually abandoned morality because it was incoherent. I discovered that it was an incoherent set of ad hoc assumptions that you couldn't use to make rational decisions, and that's how I started thinking about philosophical questions.
Yeah.
It's not like I set out to do philosophy or to develop my own value theory or something like that. It's that I discovered errors, and that forced me to to question my assumptions. So I think that's where philosophy comes from. It comes from the discovery of either false assumptions or unjustified assumptions. You have to be aware of something like that first, and then that creates the awareness that those assumptions are even there, right? Because until the assumption is either kind of demonstrably false or it's contrasted with something else, you're not aware of it. Like if you grow up in a Christian society and everybody's Christian, you're not really even aware that there's an alternative to belief in God. It just wouldn't even occur to you.
Yeah.
Unless you're a very unusual person who, questions things themselves, thinks about them, looks for contradictions. Okay, but we have one more thing to cover, so let's get through that, and then we're done.
Okay.
All right.
Representationalism.
Well, that's
Or
your thing, right?
Brain in a skullism. Yeah, but I'm going to let State of the Nile... Actually, let me just get some water. Do you guys need to take breaks or anything?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good. You can get your water, though.
All right, just give me a couple seconds here. Okay, so State of the Nile, why don't you give your epistemology or your theory of knowledge, and I mean, I don't know that we need to get into this too much because we've talked about this a lot before. Like this is sort of like in our theism debates, we talked about this a lot, but you can just, I guess, briefly give your version of it.
Okay, yeah. So my version of epistemology is basically we construct mental representations of our experiences. So there are certain, I guess you could call them cognitive predispositions, which inform how we think about the things that we're experiencing. This allows us to recognize patterns. We then make it use induction to construct these broader models of experience that we then confirm by using them to explain what we're observing and also make predictions. So what ultimately is true is what coheres to a model of experience. A model of experience can explain and predict things. That's basically it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess I would add to that our models also are they're grounded not just in sensory experience, but in emotional and motor experience as well. That without emotional and motor experience, there's no meaning. That the brain or the mind is a machine for generating output from input, right? It's a machine for generating basically muscle twitches. A few other things, secretions like tears, saliva, but almost everything that you do is through muscle twitches, right?
Yeah.
So basically the brain is a machine that takes input from the senses and it has some internal emotions, a kind of method of making value judgments, although it's pretty complex how that works. Hold on a sec, there's a siren here.
There's a mental representationist police again.
Yeah, I know. I'm getting busted again.
Yeah.
All right. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we have emotions. And I don't want to get off into a whole theory of that because that would be really complicated. But emotions give a value component to experience. They're not values themselves, but they are valuing. So our emotions evaluate experiences and evaluate our current state relative to other states. And the information of our emotions is combined with the information of our senses, and it's used to generate our motor outputs, right? What we do. But those things are always going on at the same time, and they're very interdependent. Even vision, like the way you see something is not just by focusing your eyes on it, it's by moving your eyes around. And all of your experiences are predicted not only by the outside world, but by what you choose to do, right? So if you choose to turn your head, that generates a prediction about what you're going to see, right? Because you have a model about what's over there. So when you turn your head, you expect to see something over there that you know is over there. So I guess that's what I would add to it, that our representations are ultimately about sensory, emotional, and motor experience. That is their empirical content. And they are not just there to explain and predict, but also to generate action. And that's their ultimate purpose, is to generate action. And action is generated automatically by matching representational patterns to experience. We're going through our lives sensing, emoting, and acting, and our ideas are modulating those things. They're explaining what we sense as a function of what we've sensed in the past and what we're doing now. They're predicting our emotional reactions to things, including what we do, and they're selecting actions based on emotions and sensations. And that's the ultimate grounding of knowledge. Knowledge is ultimately about generating the right muscle twitches. So, I could get into how we do that, but
well, before you get into how you do that, my immediate question is, how is that different from pragmatism?
Well, because it's not that we're just learning to do what works or learning to believe what works. In terms of generating action, we're learning to believe what minimizes the information of experience. So we're learning to predict the information of experience, but we're also learning to act in ways that are effective. But yeah, this would get into I think this is a separate conversation to get into the more psychological details of this theory.
Yeah, well, we can do that another time, because I'm like pretty much drained at this point. Like it's pretty hard for me to focus at this point.
Yeah, so let's wrap it up. But that's like, I basically agree with State of Denial. I think I have been thinking about this for longer, and I have probably a more complex psychological theory of it. But the basic gist of representationalism that we agree on, and that is, I think, correct, or a good epistemological theory, is that it makes a distinction between subject and object. It makes a distinction between representation and reality.
Yeah, that would be definitely a big distinction between what you're saying and pragmatism, from what I understand pragmatism to be, because I think that pragmatism is all about demolishing that distinction between subject and object.
Well, I don't know. Anyway, let's set that aside.
Okay. Never mind. Whatever. But
let's just set aside pragmatism. Yeah. I just want to finish the.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, so we've got subject and object, representation and reality, and the brain, which is the objective counterpart of the subject, right? And the brain induces models or theories from experience and then applies them back to experience. And let's see, is there anything else that's kind of relevant to this? Well, I guess it has some important implications. One is that things are not absolutely true or false. The representations are not entirely determined by reality, and they're not entirely determined by the subject. So they have what we were calling conceptual or metaphysical components, and they have empirical components, right? They're determined by the interplay of both of those things.
Okay.
And we can also add to that you can communicate, you can share ideas, you can learn from others, and teach other people. So it can accommodate the non-crazy aspects of social constructionism. Yeah, I don't know. Let's just leave it there because I'm really losing my voice. Unless you guys have anything to add.
No.
I think that's good.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah, this was a really good discussion. We got through a lot of stuff.
Yeah, long, this went really well.
It was fun.
Yeah, it was good. All right, guys. I'll talk to you again soon.